I've been offering a discount to anyone willing to have their reading posted up here on YouTube. And I'm very pleased to present my first taker on that offer. I want to express my gratitude for this person, who shall remain not anonymous, allowing me to put this up here. And if you find this of interest, I hope you'll go check out my website, liberationreadings.com, or contact me if you have any questions. This is an extremely long video. Most readings are at least 90 minutes. This one went longer, quite a bit longer. I actually edited a fair amount out. But the arc of this is pretty much what one might expect from a reading. So it takes a little while for it to get going. Those of you who have seen the 2 videos that I've already made about how this system works, well, some of that is covered in the beginning again, so there's a little redundancy there. So if you're already familiar with that, you might want to skip ahead. And if you're kind of going along and it's sort of interesting, but you're thinking, well, maybe I should do something else with my time, I just encourage you to skip ahead, because it does get increasingly interesting throughout the reading, although it might be difficult to skip because there's a lot of context. At any rate, I hope you find it interesting. Here you go. That's cool. So the way I like to talk about this is like a drama. We're all born with a set of things happening inside of us, and it's very much like having a bunch of different characters inside of us, all of which are vying for position, and they each have different kind of perspectives and needs and actions. And so you can think of this as being a representation of the overall drama that that you experience. The center of this can be thought of as your position on planet Earth at the moment of your birth. And this can be thought of as the configuration. It is actually a representation of the configuration of the solar system. We can think of this as being the horizon line, the rising in the east, descending in the west. Everything over here is what is essentially overhead at the moment of birth, and this is what's going on the other side of the planet. So you can think of this top part as being the part of you that's a bit more visible to others, and you can think of everything underneath the horizon line as things that are a bit more internal to you. The story of the whole thing takes place within the context of the wheel, the signs that are sometimes associated with the constellations, but I think of that as being an inaccurate way of thinking of it. The constellations were really just used in the ancient world as a way of keeping track of where we were within an annual cycle, within the year. So really what's being talked about here is an annual cycle, which is a beautiful metaphor for a life cycle. Because there are a lot of things like this spring we always think of as being the rebirth. And right here, this is the vernal equinox where the spring comes into being. And as you work your way through the year, there are different characteristics that can be associated with life cycle. So I'm going to describe that whole story now, and then we're going to place the various characters within the kind of stage setting of this basic wheel of life. So Aries is that spontaneous coming into being of something new. I like to use the metaphor of a seed and a plant. So when the seed is still attached to a plant, it's just part of the plant. But when it separates, it's now its own thing. It has its own life potential.
I was just saying it's like independence.
Exactly. So it's its own thing. It has its own potential for being, let's say, because of course a seed doesn't have to get to the germination phase. It needs to find some fertile ground, which is what Taurus is about. Taurus is like the landing place, you know, a place within which something can grow. So it's like a very foundational thing, but nothing has grown yet. This is just a life potential seed, and it really doesn't know anything. It's just carried by the winds, you could say. You know, I think of it as being Aries the ram, because the ram just kind of charges in whatever direction it happens to be going. It's not really necessarily thinking about it. It's just off in whatever direction it happened to be sent on. If it's lucky enough to find a place of fertile kind of foundation, then it can germinate, which is what Gemini is about. And Gemini is a split, some kind of a division, which is bound together. It's one thing dividing in two. So the seed in germination, part of it is reaching up towards the sun, part of it is pushing down into the earth, which are two completely opposite things. You have to have a very different sensibility of what it is you're reaching after if you're looking to get up towards the light or get down towards the moisture and the nutrient. But it's one thing doing that. And so it's like the engine of all life. I like the term incommensurate conjugal opposite, but you can just call it a an oppositional relationship, like between light and dark, or hot and cold, or life and death, if you like. All those things are the basic building blocks for all development that happens afterwards. So it's the tension between, you could call it like charge separation. There's a lot of different ways of thinking of it, but for the purposes of this metaphor, this is basically that germination process. And then the seed has to be able to get into a relationship with its environment. So it's kind of a give and receive, which is what Cancer is about. So Cancer is nurturing and at the same time starting to fulfill some role within the environment. So it's this kind of give and take type of developmental thing, which eventually allows for there to be a sense of self developed. Once the entity has built itself to a certain point, it then kind of has a perspective, which is what that sense of self is. And that sense of self can then look out into its environment and start to set things up the way it wants it to be. So it starts to act in the environment, it starts to identify the different things around it and to place it into categories and to put it into whatever kind of organization that the individual wants to the best of its ability. And then if you're able to kind of get things structured the way you want them to be structured, and that's not necessarily something that's particularly neat. There's all kinds of different structures, some of which are kind of more clear cut than others. So it has to do with the way that this being wants things to be set up. So, some of us are more, that we look more organized than others, but sometimes people can be kind of chaotic and they still have their own sense of organization. So that's something I try to mention now, because I used to just describe this simply as being organization, but then it dawned on me that not everyone's organization looks like organization. So, but anyway, you kind of get things set up the way you want them to be set up. And then you have the potential to kind of come into balance with your environment, which is what Libra's about. And so having that sense of balance, which is a little different than this foundational thing. Taurus is like the solid ground that you're using as the basis for all of this building. This is more like balancing a bunch of plates, keeping them all spinning up in the air at the same time. It's like all the various things that you need to do in order to keep this thing happening, this thing that we call ourselves. All of that needs to be maintained. And if you're able to kind of get into a balanced state, then you can look beyond your own concerns and start to appreciate that there are others inhabiting this world and that they're also kind of doing what we're doing in some way or another. They're, developing, they're trying to get what they need, and they have a sense of self, and they're trying to set things up the way they want them to be. And so by getting the sense of these others out there who are also doing their thing, we can start to deepen our understanding of what's going on in this universe. So that's Scorpio here, that getting a sense of the other. And then Sagittarius, the sage, getting a deeper understanding of the whole story here. And having deepened one's understanding of things, you're then able to get a better sense of what it is you're here to do, which is what Capricorn is about. And having a better understanding of one's kind of life purpose, a purpose that goes beyond just one's own self, but kind of more about like how it is that we fit into the big picture. That's kind of what Aquarius is. Aquarius is the big picture, seeing this whole creation as a gigantic dance with all this chaotic, crazy stuff happening. Some of it is beautiful, some of it is horrifying, but nevertheless, it's just one gigantic kind of churning existence. and we can kind of step back from it and appreciate it in its amazingness without being all wrapped up in our own particular story. And that's kind of what Aquarius is about. And then finally, kind of being able to see that big dance, we're able to step back from our own personal existence and relinquish the self so that something new can find its way in. So that's what Pisces is. Pisces is a kind of spiritual, self-sacrificing potential that all beings have, which allows for the next thing to come. And that's the wheel. So that's kind of the basic story within which everything is placed. Does that make sense so far? Do you have any questions about any of that?
Makes a lot of sense.
I kind of think of this as like the stage upon which the drama is taking place. And then these are the characters, the various objects that we keep track of. There are many objects that one can keep track of. Usually it's the planets, and then there's a number of other things like, the moon and your ascendant, descendant, midheaven. So let's start to talk a little bit about some of the major objects here. It's typical to start with the sun, and I think that's a good idea because the sun is really the thing that organizes the whole solar system. It's why we call it a solar system. So the sun is basically the organizing principle of the solar system. It's the source of all the energy that's radiating out through the various objects in the solar system. And so that's basically what it is for us. Yours is in Cancer. It's close enough to Leo so that there's some Leo here. It's 27 degrees in Cancer. So that means that like the most kind of the source of your power and the kind of thing which organizes your life is that reciprocation thing, the give and take, the kind of nurturing aspect of Cancer. But there's also a fair amount of the sense of self involved in that. Does that ring true?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And yeah, please interject at any point if you have something to correct me on, or if you think something doesn't make sense, or if and really whatever you want to say. And because we're doing this over Zoom, there's a little bit of delay, so sometimes it's a little awkward in the back and forth, but we'll just figure it out as we go along. So yeah, just jump in anytime you want to. And then I like to talk about the moon next because it's the closest thing to the Earth, and it really represents our emotional center. And so for you, it suggests that you have an emotional life that has opposition as its main characteristic. There's maybe swings between love and hate, or like anger and so there would be a lot of dramatic swings. Does that kind of ring true?
Yeah, like I've been like beyond like looking like reading and actually looking at things in my chart like lately, I've definitely sort of always felt a sense of like to me it doesn't feel like conflicting. It just feels like I guess like Gemini, like the twins, like two feelings almost like at once, like.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like I could go, or like I'm okay sort of feeling either way. It's just sort of at the moment, I guess. Like,
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that's really interesting to hear, because the way that Gemini appears, I think, is quite often different from how Gemini experiences itself. And I think it does kind of come down to that seed which is going in both directions at once. As far as it's concerned, it's one thing, but it may appear from the outside that there are two opposite things happening. And I've got a lot
it
of
makes me
familiar.
think of like cell division,
It makes you think of what?
like cell division.
Yeah, I think that there's a correlation there, except that cell
Where the cell
division.
is like flipping, it's growing.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you. What did you say?
Oh, I was just like relating like cell division to um like a metaphor of like both dividing yet growing at the same time.
Yep, I like that. That makes sense. So you're like being pulled apart, and yet at the same time, there's a whole being formed.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I've been thinking of the metaphor that I use in this part of the description is a seed and a plant, but I've been also thinking about how you might describe that in like mammalian terms, inside of the womb,
Mm.
perhaps. And so, you'd have the seed, which in the womb
Ah,
then, right, kind of take, uh, and so this would be like the sperm and egg, which then form the most basic unit, and then this is like kind of the building of the embryo and the baby, which I think probably by the time you're a more fully formed baby, there already is some kind of basic sense of self, maybe. I don't know. It's hard to say, but you could say that really this wouldn't happen until you're already out in your own environment. Although maybe there's a way in which a baby starts to try to take action already within the womb. So it's not like an exact, metaphor is always poetic, and it doesn't really have the same kind of like category definitiveness as a scientific way of approaching things would be. But nevertheless, I think it's a really neat way of viewing the same thing. So yeah, it's an interesting. I've got a lot of relationship with a lot of Gemini, so I'm kind of steeped in Gemini in a lot of ways. Even though I mean, it is a part of my chart, but it's not my moon, it's not my sun. That realm is something that has always been of concern to me and continues to be. And I find it ever more kind of elemental to what I see happening. So it's an interesting place to be, and I think it's also amazing to have a natural feeling for it, because I think it's something that quite often people can't really quite get there. If they don't have a natural feeling for it, it's difficult for people to really get a grasp of it because it seems so contradictory.
yeah.
So then we can kind of work our way out from the sun, if you like. We could talk about Mercury here, which is the smallest planet, and it's right next to the sun, and it's kind of moving quickly. And you can think of it as the thing which is closest to, in us, the thing which is closest to the source of our energy, the thing that's organizing us, which is basically our mind. Our mind is continually trying to figure out, how do we maintain connection to source? How do we keep this life going? And so there's sort of the mental obsession with the sun, but it's a very tiny thing. It doesn't have the greatest influence when it comes to producing the results that it's looking for. So in some ways, you might say that Mercury is kind of analogous to the monkey mind within Buddhism, that it's kind of
Mm.
jumping around trying to like get what it wants, but it's not always the most effective thing at being able to produce the results it's looking for. Yours is in Leo, which suggests that your mind is quite often concerned with your own circumstance, your own situation, your own sense of self. And so does that ring true?
Yeah, I'd say so because I've had conversations with people um like I feel like there's like I see like certain people like sort of have a general like almost more concern for themselves like the way I see it. I'm like, why are you so worried about like other people? You should worry about yourself first, like so that you can worry about others.
Interesting. Uh-huh. Yep. Well, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to consider is just how many possible configurations there are within this setup. And so, like, quite often at some point or another in a reading, I'll start talking about, well, it may seem as if this is the logical place for Mercury to be for everyone. Like, why wouldn't you think of yourself first? And in many respects, it's absolutely true. Like, if you don't take care of yourself, how are you going to take care of others? But this Mercury could be anywhere. Someone could be primarily, I mean, actually, I'll tell you that for me, it's over here in Aries, which means that my
Mm.
mind is just, it goes here, it goes there. There's like a new thing that comes in, and then the next thing you know, it's something else, and it's just all over the place. so so it's kind of funny to consider, some people's minds are in Taurus, which means that they're just like, it's basically one thing they're thinking about. It's just solidly planted in one particular thing, and they have that kind of just, and it may have nothing to do with themselves. It may have to do with whatever it is that they're particularly oriented towards. you know so it's just really interesting to realize just how different the configuration can be within all of us. So if we move from Mercury now to Venus, we can talk about, Venus is this mediator between Earth and Sun. So that's basically why it's considered to be about relationship. And a lot of people think of it as being about love, but I don't think it's just like romantic love. It's talking about the way that we really bond with others. And so it's like a functional type of relationship. What is the type of relationship that works for you? And so it suggests here that for you, the relationships that work are the ones that where there's a kind of symbiotic relationship. There's a mutual give and take. And at the same time, there's a certain amount of contradiction. There's a certain amount of tension, perhaps. There's a certain amount of that opposition. But maybe, the way you were describing before, maybe it's not so much tension. It's just that recognition that there's opposition involved. And it is all one thing, even though it could be, one side of it 1 minute and the other side of the coin the next. Does that kind of ring true?
Yeah, because I'm definitely like it make like even in mentioning it, I didn't really think of like romantic relationships first. I guess I thought of more so like well, first people I imagined was like my family, and then I guess like friends that are like, close to the point where they're sort of considered family. I imagine like a lot of just sort of like shared experience and consideration for like each other in a relationship, but also like strong like sense of like I am who I am, you are who you are, and like we choose to come together at this time for whatever purposes we want to.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So in a sense, you're saying like that maintaining one's own individual sense of identity is what's represented here in that Gemini influence. It's holding together despite the differences.
Yeah, because
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I could be like friends with someone that's like a totally different like person than me, period. Like if there was somewhere where like we wanted to like come and hold a space for each other, even if it's just to converse or something.
Amen. I think that's a particularly important skill and way of seeing things at this moment in time.
Definitely, yeah.
So it's also the case that you have Mars here in Cancer, which suggests that the actions that you take would also be within this context of nurturing a symbiotic relationship, this give and take. That's something that is a real motivator for whatever it is that you're going to do.
Yes, definitely. Case in point, okay, like something just came to mind, right? Like recently, I've just been just like I've been at a job for a while and just, considering if I should stay or not. And like my main consideration in taking that action is, am I going to benefit enough from being here? And am I actually going to, contribute in a meaningful way? Like I'm a computer programmer, and like we work on projects, and we can we can get things done. Um, but I am a lot in considering, like I guess, sort of the efficiency in how we work together to getting it done. Like I don't want to work here, and yes, I know that we can continue to do things, but if I don't like enjoy the process, I guess if I don't feel like I'm getting enough or like contributing enough, then I don't want to do that.
Right. That's fascinating that you say that, because right here is the midheaven. And what the midheaven represents is the thing that keeps you involved. So you can think of
Mm,
this, everything up here, as being the kind of cycles of activity, the thing that you get involved in, what you're doing during the day, is sort of like the thing that's most visible. And the ascendant
Mhm.
is the thing that's likely to get you involved in something, which, so like the motivator for wanting to get involved in a project or to do a particular type of activity. Patterns of behavior too, will be this realm of finding balance, like a way to keep all the plates spinning will be the thing that's like, yeah, I want to get involved in that. And then the thing that's going to see you through when you're in the middle of something like that, because this is just an initiator, right? When you're in the middle of a
Mhm.
project, you go along and it's like, oh man, now I'm in the middle of the whole
Like,
thing.
oh,
For you, it'll be like, am I actually getting what I need out of this? And am I actually contributing to it? Those are going to be the things, like if you can feel like those conditions are met, then yeah, you'll see it through to the end. Um, the descendant here is the way that you're likely to want to end things. And it can go one of two ways. Sometimes you might be tempted to end something because there's too much spontaneity going on. It feels like, well, maybe this isn't really a stable ship because it's just going off in different directions. Or sometimes it may be more like you want to be more spontaneous and you don't want to be locked down to what's going on in this commitment, right? And so that might make you go, you know what, I've had enough of this. I need to go do my own thing. But I don't see a lot of other Aries there. So, if I was going to guess, I'd say maybe it's more like the first thing. Like if you feel like there's too much chaos or too many new things being thrown at you or whatever, then maybe it might be more the type of thing that would make you go, I don't know. I'm not sure if it's something I really want to stay involved with. Does any of that ring true?
yeah, definitely. Like, to me, I guess the sort of inconsistency uh, is a bit of a turnoff and demotivator.
Yep. And that's totally what Aries is, because Aries is sort of like a novelty generator. So like a whole bunch of new shit ends up popping up and it's like, man, what does this have to do with what we're doing? you know,
Literally the thoughts in my head.
really? Wow. Yeah. It's interesting. So then the other point here, imam coli, is when you're outside of the cycles of activity, outside of those projects and the work cycle or whatever it is, this is where you get your rest. This is where you recharge your batteries. And so it's a kind of an interesting place because it suggests that you recharge yourself on the basis of finding the thing that you're here to do. Like the idea of kind of fulfilling your mission in life, whatever that is the thing that makes you have energy again. You're just like, yeah, man, I'm ready for whatever I got to do next. Is that right?
Yeah, like I often get a sense of like, I guess even when I get like sort of like down, I'm like, well, like I meant to be here. Like I'm still going forward. Like
Mm-hmm.
those sort of like, yeah, like just sort of taking, I guess, like I imagine it as sort of like taking it sort of like for what it is and just like rolling with it and just being okay.
Mm-hmm. And that you still have a sense of purpose even when you're kind of on that outs, right?
Yeah, like
Mm-hmm.
it's like I'm imagining like a well or like a V shape with just like a little bit of left at the bottom. Like it's there. Like when like it's never empty.
Hmm. Mm-hmm. So we've kind of covered the planets on the inside, the the I think of the solar system as kind of being divided between everything to the inside of the asteroid belt and everything to the outside of the asteroid belt. The inside of the asteroid belt are these rocks, basically hard planets. We got water here on planet Earth, but basically compared to the gas giants, these are pretty hard, tangible, kind of practical concerns having to do with what we're thinking about, the source of our power, the general emotional life, the way that we bond with others, the kind of action we take. Then when you get into the outer planets, Jupiter is like the experience that you have over the course of life, because You're born with a certain type of nature, which is like the sun. But the secondary influence in the solar system, the second largest mass, is Jupiter. And so Jupiter is a representation of all the things that happen to you over the course of time. And so it forms this like kind of amorphous that it's very difficult to summarize all the things that have happened to someone and say, yeah, that's the thing that's speaking inside of me. But in a way, that is really one of the loudest voices, is whatever it is that we've encountered and experienced in our lives.
Like sort of a theme in a way, or like,
I think it's more like all of the things that have happened wrapped up into one package, even if you can't put a name on it.
okay, yeah, okay,
So for you, it's in Pisces, and it's 28 degrees, so you got a little bit of Aries going on there too. So that suggests that your life experience has taught you that self-sacrifice and spirituality are really important. But there's also a little
yeah,
bit of that sense of novelty, of looking for something new, of the kind of freshness of the unexpected, of spontaneity that is folded into that. So that's also something that's important to you. It's retrograde, so anytime we see an R here, there's a few retrograde objects here, that suggests that sometimes this is really not clear. It's not clear to you whether it's going one way or the other at times. So because we're on planet Earth, and so we're not in the center of this thing, we're off to the side, and when we're watching other things going around the sun, every now and then it looks like they're moving backwards through the signs when in fact they're moving forward. So at the moment of your birth, it
mm-hmm.
appeared as if Jupiter was moving backwards. So that just means
Oh
that
wow.
it's not always easy to get a fix on like, what is this experience really telling me? But that's kind of what is suggested. Does that ring any bells?
Definitely, yeah.
Cool. So then if Jupiter is experience, then Saturn is the thing that, well, gets you beyond your experience. And and so this suggests here, because it's in Taurus, that the way that you open up the envelope of your experience is through finding a more firm foundation. Although, interestingly, because it's just 3 degrees in, we got a little influence of Aries here as well. So you have an interesting, you might say, Gemini relationship here, that your experience will open up mainly on the basis of founding a more solid foundation for yourself. But at the same time, you want a little dash of that spontaneity to keep it from getting too stagnant, you might say. Does that ring true?
Definitely. And I guess like that makes me think that it would sort of, I guess, not influence the Jupiter in a way, but make sense of why like it's hard to see that like spirituality is important at times, because I'm always trying to just like I imagine it as sort of like survival in a way, like of
Uh-huh.
just, but yeah, like not like, yeah, like in, but in the sense of like finding a home, like
Yeah.
that sort of survival. Like,
Yeah, I totally hear that. And what you say is really interesting, because if you think about it, everything that happens within the domain of a new experience automatically gets folded into life experience. So you could say that in essence, Jupiter has always been fed by Saturn. And traditionally, Saturn is, I mean, there's some really interesting things about Saturn. I don't want to go down a total rabbit hole here, but uh, one is that in traditionally, quite often, Saturn is thought of as being a challenge of some sort of difficulty. And so, yeah, getting beyond your own experience is always difficult. But once you do it, it's folded into the rest of your experience, right? The other thing that's really interesting about
yeah.
Saturn is that supposedly there's some evidence to suggest that at one time Saturn was a sun, and that it may have been like the original sun in this solar system, and that it kind of got taken over, which is, a little it's just a little interesting artifact of some of the thinking that's been thrown around out there for a while. But yeah, there's some really interesting books about, they call it old Saturn, and how it may be that the structure of our solar system was radically different in the past, which also is an interesting thing to consider, because there's a way of thinking that, oh, this is the way that it works, right? But we could easily imagine that the solar system might get rearranged, like, let's say, for example, by the introduction of a relatively large massive object just working its way through it. And so then things would start to behave differently. So it's kind of fascinating to think about how delicate all of this is, even the arrangement of the system within which we're living, which is by far more resilient than we are here on Earth, I would imagine. So if we continue to work our way out, we run across Uranus. Uranus is like somewhat related to the concept here in Capricorn, in the sense that it's about your gift, the thing that you're here to offer the world on some basic level. And this is related to that universalism, the kind of picture of all things dancing together, like what you said before about feeling like you could be friends with anyone if you had something like a mutual appreciation for difference, that it wouldn't matter what the difference was. That's a very Aquarian sensibility, and it sounds to me that that's kind of a skill that's really a very inherent skill within you. Although, of course, it's a retrograde here, so at times it may seem like it's not functioning. So, for instance, if you're someone who has this kind of a skill in the context of a society who's having a very hard time dealing with difference, well, then it may feel like at times, well, this is not actually a skill I have, because people are getting upset because I'm talking about different stuff than what they want to hear. So that might be one possibility where one might have some doubts about what the skill is that you really have. But this suggests that, yeah, what you're here to do is to operate in this realm on some kind of cosmic level. Does that ring true at all?
Yeah, I definitely resonated with like a lot of what you just said, especially like, a sort of feeling of like, well, no one wants to hear it. But like I don't get it as, yeah, I get it, so like feel it sometimes, like I feel like I don't necessarily feel it closely from the people around me, but more so like in a general sense, like, like the
Right.
masses. And yeah.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I get it in the personal sense quite often, but I also think, and I wonder, because I meet a lot of people who suggest that maybe the world's a little bit more open than it looks like when you're looking at what's going on in the media. So I wonder to what extent there's the kind of disagreement and polarization that it is being suggested is going on.
Hmm.
It's
Like it
really,
might not even be that much of a difference, really.
well, if we go back to here, then we would have to recognize that all polarization is fundamentally a unity. And so, there may be two sides that actually think that they're different. So if you think of like the part of the plant that's reaching up towards the sun and the part of the thing that's reaching down to the ground, they may think that they're kind of on separate missions. Those parts of the plant may be like, screw you, I'm going down, uh, but
Hmm.
uh, but the plant itself would, in the center, recognize that both of those things were necessary. So I guess the question is whether or not there's still enough of a center within humanity to recognize that really that's the thing that's important. And I guess in some respects you could say that that is the key question moving forward right now, because it does appear that we are on the threshold of either, falling apart or finding some new way of organizing ourselves that isn't so problematic for everyone.
And it feels kind of immediate and dire.
I think that's right. I agree. Yep. And then the question, of course, is to what extent is that immediate sense something which is actual or kind of manufactured? And, my sense is that,
Exactly.
yeah, there's a lot of both. I think there's some actual urgency that's been building for a long time, but I also feel like it's being taken advantage of and used and kind of manufactured and pushed to its limit. So it's a complicated and confusing situation that we're in right now.
Definitely. I oftentimes I feel like get a sort of sense of, I guess I feel a bit of I guess, contention in the sense of like, I mean, like this, I mean, this world, this universe, like people, we've been here and we're going to continue to be here for as long as we have been and as long as we will be. Like in this, um, I guess I believe a lot in sort of destiny and fate and like accepting it in a sort of way, but not like I had a conversation with someone where they were like, so how can you believe in destiny and free will? And I don't really see like a difference. Like I feel like it's your destiny to pursue your will. Like
I think that's really an interesting set of things to think about, and I basically agree. I think that there's a kind of a dialogue between our will and our destiny that involves some other factors. There, we are in a world that doesn't submit to our will, and yet our will is the only thing that we can exercise in changing the course that we're on. And ultimately, no matter what we do, there is a destiny for us. There's a destination. That's a negotiation between our will and the circumstance that we find ourselves in. So you could say, like, basically it's like the Tao, the way that things are, and then there is the effort on the part of the individual to, either align themselves with how things are or go their own way, which I think is always a crapshoot.
mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't think of destiny and free will as being inconsistent, but I think that there is an element of a very big element of uncertainty when it comes to what destiny turns out to be. However, it's interesting that in the chart there's an object that I quite often associate with destiny, although it's maybe not the best word. I kind of think of it more as a little bit like the thing that we're magnetically drawn towards. And so for you, this is in Virgo. It's very close to Leo. So you might say that it has to do with organizing things to the best of your ability, trying to figure out what the hell's going on and to get it set up in the way you want it to be set up. And in order to serve yourself in many respects, in order to like preserve the self, preserve the integrity of the self, you could say. And it's retrograde, so at times it's not clear what is meant by that or whether or not you're heading in that right direction. But in general, there would be this kind of pull, a feeling of wanting to figure out, how do I get things set up right so that I'm able to exist in the best way possible. And it's also
Wow.
interesting that right here you have Fortuna, which is pretty much just in Virgo, and that's kind of the way you make your fortunes. And so I'd say that this is an excellent place for a computer programmer because it's all about organizing and analyzing, which is pretty much what coding is, right? Is figuring out how do you structure algorithm and information flow so that you're going to get the best outcome. So that's a nice fit, I'd say.
Wow.
Now, opposite to the northern node, the thing that you're magnetically drawn towards is the southern node, which is a little bit more like the thing that you are moving away from. Sometimes it may feel like something in the past that you wanted to get away from. Sometimes it may feel more like you're being pushed away from it. But either way, it's a place that you came from, so you have familiarity with it. And so that suggests that you have some kind of that type of relationship here in the spiritual kind of self-sacrifice domain.
I
That's
definitely say that, yeah.
That makes sense. And then it's also tinged with a little bit of this Aquarian thing of like the universalism, it's all one world, like everyone's dancing together. So, maybe there's a way in which like some kind of sense of larger community and the self-sacrifice necessary in order to hold that together was, and within a spiritual context, maybe a more religious structured context would be the kind of thing that you felt like, maybe I'd actually want to get away from that and go my own way.
Yeah, yeah, definitely because like um I'm from Alabama. Um it has more churches than probably any other state, I think.
Huh.
I don't know exact. But yeah, I definitely, yeah, like because I always like as a kid, like I liked church. but I didn't necessarily like I mean, like I'm not against like religion and things, but I just wasn't very much so about like the oneness and I guess like this is what's correct for you, this is what's correct for everybody.
Hmm.
I was like, well, what if they just want to do that? It's not so bad if they want to do that. Like, if they're, hurting people and things. I mean, that brought me to certain places and situations with, like older members and things of my family, like looking at me a certain way. Because, like, I used to go up and, like, read, like, just be active and, like, be there, be in the choir, all sorts of things. And then, like, as I got older, strayed further away. And, it's like, yeah, now I feel myself a lot more so inclined to actually explore that, but definitely like I associated a lot with like doing it in sort of my own way.
Right on. Yep, that makes perfect sense. And it's interesting to think about this Aquarian influence as being that sense of the assumption within a religious group like in Christianity that the whole world would be better off if everyone was just living like us, and it seems like that's kind of a pretty common thing within a lot of religious organizations, that they have this sense of destiny, you could say, that somehow or another, at some point or another, the whole world is going to be living under, our conception of what the right way is to live. But
Mm.
but it's also interesting that some religions, and Christianity is one of them, have groups within them that are very accepting of others. And there have been periods of time within almost all of the great religious traditions where there's, more or less kind of sense of universalism. And so you have like the Unitarian Church, that's kind of a Christian denomination, but it's very open to a lot of different types of faiths. And then you have, I think, within some of the more, let's say, enlightened subgroups within Catholicism, there's also, I think, a very like open, accepting, loving attitude towards all kinds of different people, regardless of their beliefs.
Mm.
So it's really interesting how that, and actually that's also the case within Islam. Islam went through periods where they were very accepting of people who had different beliefs, and that's obviously not the case with many parts of Islam now, but I think there's probably still some of that going on here and there. So yeah, it's very interesting that seems to be something which is continually happening. It's almost like a cyclical pattern within religious institutions.
Yes, like over and over.
Hmm. Well, in some respects, until the configuration of the solar system changes, it's sort of the same story over and over again, in some basic way.
Yeah,
Um,
the different character settings, huh?
yeah, it's like, okay, so I like a system analysis way of looking at this whole thing, because basically, like when you have a meta system, if it continues to operate in the same basic way, well, then all subsystems are going to be subject to it, right? And that's basically what we have here. So we can expect things to,
Mm.
continue as they have on some cyclical basis, because we're talking about cycles here. All of this is calculated on the basis of being able to predict locations of things which are obviously cyclical. Now, some new things may show up every now and then, a comet, an asteroid, what have you. But as of yet, it hasn't really interrupted the whole shebang, at least not since back in the day. There's that theory about Saturn. There's also another really interesting theory about Venus being a comet. And apparently, there's a lot of really interesting kind of
I
archaeological
heard about
information.
that
Why am
before.
I pointing at Neptune? Venus up here. There's a lot of really interesting information from kind of a global archaeological point of view, ancient texts that refer to Venus as being a comet. And there's a group of plasma scientists and comparative mythologists that run this website called thunderbolts.info, that's kind of based on that idea that our solar system was reorganized because Venus came streaming into it. And so they're trying to kind of reverse engineer what may have happened. And one of the most interesting things about Venus is that it's spinning the opposite direction of every other object in the solar system. And so that does suggest that it was probably not originally of this solar system. So yeah,
Okay.
all kinds of fascinating things to think about in that world. But like I said, let's not get too distracted. I want to try and finish up with the characters here, and then we can start to explore the way that they're relating to each other. So we had talked about Uranus. Next after that, we've got Neptune, which is kind of like the spiritual path. You could think about this as being the kind of karmic drama that you inherited at the moment of your birth and that you're playing out through the course of your life, but which at some way or another, you always have the option of trying to find a way to resolve so that you're no longer ruled by it. And that's basically what Neptune is. Neptune is the path that one walks in order to resolve the drama that you inherited at birth. And so for you, it's a tightrope walk that's right between this Aquarius, the universalism, seeing the whole uh, awesome, horrible pageantry of existence as a totality, and at the same time, a fair amount of this sense of fulfilling my purpose. You know, what am I here to do? I've got to find a way to do that. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
And then Pluto.
Hmm.
Pluto would be the attainment of that spiritual goal.
Hmm.
And you know, at one point, I was thinking of using Pluto as the model for, you know, because ideally we would all find some way, particularly as we enter an Aquarian age, of releasing the bind of the ego. And you could say that basically this chart is a description of the struggle that the ego has within itself. And so the idea of
Mhm.
liberation reading is to liberate oneself from your own karmic inheritance. And so Pluto would be that kind of the success of that goal. It's a long shot. It's way out there. It's almost impossible to find. In your case, it's also retrograde, so that makes it more difficult. But on the other hand, it's really good to know that it's out there, and it's good to get a sense of where it resides so that you can kind of at
Mhm.
least head in that direction to whatever extent is possible. And so for you, that's in the domain of knowing. So increasing your knowledge and understanding of things is what helps to relieve you of the drama of the chart, you could say.
Mhm.
Or, you know, it's working in tandem with Neptune, really, because this would be like the completion of it, I would say. Right here is Ceres, which is a representation of the asteroid belt. So the largest asteroid in the asteroid belt, Ceres, you can kind of think of it as being the barrier between the inner planets and the outer planets. So if the inner planets are kind of like the pragmatic aspect of life, and the outer planets are a little bit more spiritually oriented, like a grander sense of purpose than just, you know, individual survival. Well, then this is sort of like the blockage between the two of them. It's like the barrier between the pragmatic, practical part of life and the kind of more grander sense of what life's adventure is about. And so something having to do with stability. You know, you mentioned something before about feeling that need to find a more solid footing to stand on, right? And that of opening your experience here with Saturn. A big part of that is trying to find that home, I think was the word you used, right?
Mhm.
And so that realm also plays that role of being the stumbling block between practical concerns uh, and kind of grander designs. And you could say that makes a lot of sense, just because, you know, when we're trying to figure out how to get solid ground under our feet, who has time for all these highfalutin
Yeah.
spiritual designs and stuff like that?
I imagine just like being comfortable and just existing and not striving for anything.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing too about Gemini is that it allows for the possibility that this contradiction wouldn't be an impossibility to
Yeah.
manage, right?
Okay. We're
Yep.
feeling like that.
Yep. Now, it's also the case that you have the vertex here, and that suggests that it's super important for you to maintain that foundational torus under your feet. And because if it's not there, then nothing fucking works. uh, so it's really an important element there. It's kind of the linchpin that keeps all this stuff functioning. And then opposite Taurus, we got a fair amount of things happening here in Scorpio that we haven't discussed. We are Chiron, Eros, and here is called Lilith. So Chiron is like the wound which through the process of healing becomes a strength. So this is considered a pretty important object, not only in Western astrology, but I believe that the Vedics also consider it to be extremely important. It's actually the name of the software that I use. So the guys who developed this software felt that this was significant enough that they would name their package after it. And so, yeah, it has to do with like the id, the sense of our the energy direction that we feel in life and where we want to go, that somehow or another it gets blocked or cut off. It happens to all of us at one point or another, and it typically happens early on. So for you, it has something to do with others, like relation with others, or a sense of what the other is. And yet over the course of time, this becomes a great strength. And so your ability, you might say, with others is ever growing. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I resonate with that a lot.
And then you have Eros here, and this suggests that you hold dear inside of yourself a cherished image of the other, and that the other is, you know, it may be that it's a specific other, but it also may be just that the sense of otherness is something that is a cherished image that you hold. And so kind of the idea of meeting the other, of like an ideal other, an ideal sense of connective with other, is something you hold really dear inside of yourself.
Yeah, yeah, I feel that a lot.
And then there's this last one here, which is it's kind of like, if you're familiar with Carl Jung, it's the concept of the shadow. So it's the thing kind of hidden inside of us that feels like a deep, dark secret, but in some ways it kind of holds the key to everything, but we can't quite see it because it's all in darkness, and it's sort of like unrealized impulses and motivations that can't quite come to the surface, and in a lot of respects just because we're afraid of them, the shadow. So that's the domain of this here. And you know, maybe there's a little bit of Libra there, but mostly we're talking about Scorpio. It's that sense of other. So other has a mysterious, dark side to it as well. So this is really an interesting configuration, because you could say that here is the thing which wounded you that becomes a skill and a real like strength that you have with respect to the other. And on one side of that is this idealized image, and on the other side of this is it's almost like the devil and the angel on the shoulders of Chiron.
That's what I imagine. Yeah,
Which is kind of wild. So now we've gone through all the characters that are here, and we can start to talk about what's going on here, if you like. And we can do this either by, you know, whatever you want me to kind of look into, or I can just tell you what I see in the strongest relationships, which would be beginning with what this tells us. However you like to proceed.
okay, yeah, yeah. What are the strongest relationships and things?
Well, some of my favorite relationships are these noviles, because they suggest growth. So you have two very strong novile relationships. One is between Sun and Fortuna, and the other is between, well, again, here we can't say for sure because we don't know the exact time. So I can't say much about this. I mean, I could say, okay, Imam Koli and Pluto, which is neat, but we don't know, you know, because let's see, 5 minutes goes by and what happens? It's gone.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to eliminate that as a possibility, sadly. And you know what I might do, just for the sake of not getting confused? I think I'm going to eliminate those 4 points from Okay. So just so I don't start talking about stuff that we don't know about, I'll go back
Hmm.
to, yeah, that's Sun Fortuna, which means that central organizing principle in your life in Cancer is always bringing new things to, like, the way that you make your way in the world. So your fortunes are well served by that basic nature of yours, and vice versa. These go both ways. So you could say that you're making your fortune in the world strengthens that power of your sun and brings something new to it, is an even more better way of putting it, because a developmental type of relationship where new things are happening. Here you have a more problematic relationship, which is Venus and Pluto. So this suggests that it's called a septile relationship. It suggests that relationships will cut you off from the potential of being able to free yourself from your own karma. Um, and it can operate the other way as well. So if you were to dedicate yourself to a spiritual path in pursuit of freedom from karma, that might separate you from your relationships. Uh,
That makes me. Have you
Go
ever seen
ahead.
like Avatar, Airbender?
Avatar?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a part in like the last Airbender where he goes to the guru, and the guru tells him that he has to like cut off his connections with others, or he
Mm-hmm.
won't be able to balance within himself into the world.
Mm-hmm.
But not necessarily like cut them off, but like I don't know. It's like it was like detachment. He was having issues with detachment. It's sort of what it was.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's a theme that you see both within Christianity and Buddhism. There's a, you know, Jesus talks about how you have to leave your family behind, and the same thing with Buddha. I believe there's something about Buddha and his mom where there's a kind of, I guess you'd say, like renunciation. I can't remember the details, but it seems like that's a pretty common theme, and it makes sense because the things that hold us to the structures of life, spiritual, because it's, in essence, we're talking about the domain here where you're relinquishing what was before in order for something new to happen, in order to make room for the next generation, in order to make room for the thing that has to refresh the the existence. And when things are set up the way that we want, that's kind of like, you could say that there's a way in which societies and civilizations have the same basic life cycle. They're based upon some kind of a
Mhm.
spontaneous event. One group breaks off from another group, and they're able to find some little patch of land that they can then work and develop, and they start to develop a sense of common purpose as a culture, and they set things up like rituals and rules and laws and all that kind of thing in order to create balance within themselves and develop, like what, trading relationships with others, and they deepen their understanding of things through an appreciation of other civilizations, blah, 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 right? Towards the end of it is the difficult phase where they're going to have to give up on all of that structure in order for something new to come along. And that's always a problematic thing because people are very reluctant to let go of the tradition in a family or in a social organization. But it's kind of an inevitable cycle. Nothing lasts forever, so it's just an uncomfortable transition. So that was a lot of me blabbing on about stuff, but it's definitely a theme and something that I think expresses itself in all of us in various ways. But you've got that strong relationship here. This is a relationship that's in everyone's chart. It doesn't really mean anything because the northern and the southern node are always opposite each other. And then you have this kind of taijutsu between Chiron and Ceres, so that the thing that, and this is actually 0 degrees, it's an aspect relationship that's pretty much 100% on the nose. So that division between your pragmatic life and the more kind of ephemeral spiritual part of life, it has this transforming relationship with that strength with others. So, the way that the wound and the strength with others. And so that might be like the wound and the strong part are oscillating, and that as it morphs from one to the other, you're more or less inclined to be pragmatic or more or less inclined to be on a spiritual kind of grander adventure. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we open it up to the next level, we see another nice novile. It's a binovile between Jupiter and Fortuna. And so over the course of your experience in life, you're able to bring new things to your fortune, which is a really nice thing. And of course, you're finding your fortunes and building them, you might say, that brings new things to your experience as well. So
Mm.
that's kind of neat. And then we're starting to see a couple of other septiles, which is that kind of cutting off relationship. So the thing that you're drawn towards, this northern node, which is in that kind of organizing, analyzing, getting things set up the way you want with respect to yourself, that is cut off with respect to the experience that you're having. So how do we say that in a meaningful way? It's like you want to head towards something where there's a greater sense of having things set up the way you want them to be, but your life's experience over here is kind of telling you that, it ain't always about how you want things to be set up. So, it's sort of like it's one or the other. Like you're going to get that kind of life lesson feeling that makes you feel like, I really got to let go of me getting everything set up the way I want it to be. But then there's going to be moments where you're like, I don't care what my life experience is telling me. I just want to get some shit set up the way I want it to be. So they're just kind of it's a perfect example of the kind of thing where I'm describing characters talking to each other. So that's like the way that Jupiter
Yeah,
and
I've seen like. Mm.
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just see they like almost like um yeah, like cut each other off, like
Yeah,
undermine each other.
absolutely.
Imagining.
Yeah, septile is separation. They separate from each other. You've got a nice trine here between Jupiter and the Sun. So a very harmonious kind of relationship between your life experience and the Sun, the kind of basic nature. So your basic nature is in a good relationship with the experiences that you've undergone and that you've incorporated, you could say. There's a decile relationship between Sun and Moon that's also very strong. And that's like, homeopathics. In essence, you're taking something that's a little bit toxic, but in the right amount, it's stimulating a response in the body that's healthy. And that's basically what it is. It's like a little bit of emotionality is really good for your basic nature, you know? And a little bit of that kind of like cancer give and take basic nature is good for your emotional well-being. But too much of one or the other is not going to be great. Too much of that Gemini thing in an emotional package can be can be not really all that great for your basic nature, for your Sun. So I think of that as being good. It's basically a useful relationship and just kind of one to be aware of. Like if things start getting too emotional, it might wear out your basic power, right? And you could say like if you allow too much of the Sun to rule, then your emotional life might kind of get dampened. So it's kind of like just in the right amount, give each other a little taste, and they're happy. You got a sextile with Ceres, so your basic nature really likes that kind of. It's sort of there's something stimulating about, let's say, the dividing line between your pragmatic part of your life and the more ephemeral, grander sense of existence. And so I could kind of imagine that as being a little bit like sitting on the wall and looking on one side to like the things that you're setting up practically in your life, and then you're looking at the other side, and it's like, oh man, there's all these like cosmic potential as well. It's like, so I'm kind of like, I'm living on this boundary line between having a solid practical existence and a more kind of adventurous, open-ended, grand sense of existence. And that's a exciting kind of place to be. We got a couple of quintiles right here between Eros and Neptune, and that suggests that. Do you know anything about five element theory?
Five element theory, no.
Yeah, it's a Chinese system, and it's like, it's really interesting. I'm not going to get into the depth of it, but it's basically like how the material world transforms thermodynamically, I think is really the best way of thinking of it. And so it's like
Mm.
energy conversion from one form into another. Like water turns into wood, and wood turns into fire, and fire turns into
Ah,
earth, and earth
yeah.
turns into metal, and metal turns into water. It kind of goes around and around. So it's that kind of a type of relationship. And it's between Neptune, which is the spiritual path, which for you is on the cusp here between Aquarius and Capricorn. So it's like that universalism with the sense of purpose kind of folded together to walk away from the karma that you were handed at birth, and that has that five element relationship with the cherished image, which has to do with the other. So this is a complicated relationship. It's interesting to try to figure out what it means. You could say that basically at times the spiritual path that you're walking seems to bring the relationship with the other, that kind of idealized other, into focus. And at other times, it seems that it's making it disappear, that it's farther and farther away. Like you're getting kind of uh, a it's another kind of cyclical pattern of transformation where it always feels progressive because it's always something new, but at the same time, you just can't quite get your mitts on it. It's not like you're not able to grasp it, because the next thing you know, it transforms into something else.
Mm.
And it's worth talking a little bit more about Eros, because a cherished image is still a cherished image. So the extent to which it corresponds to something that actually exists is at least uncertain. And you might say that quite often it's the case that an image bears little relation to the things that exist, and that we construct images inside of ourselves to give us a kind of cleaner relationship with something, to give us an impetus, something to inspire us, which is a beautiful thing, and shouldn't be thought of as like a problem. But I think it's also worth kind of noting that quite often these are idealized forms that don't necessarily have a correspondence with anything in reality. And so, the pursuit of the cherished image is something which is kind of by nature frustrating. And yet at the same time, it's something which is incredibly inspiring and useful, because it gets us off our butt and moving towards what we hope will be something better. And at times it really does lead us to something better, even if it isn't the thing that we thought we were looking for. And I think a big part of the pursuit of the cherished image is the recognition, when you found something that's better, even if it doesn't look like that cherished image. Quite often.
That's what I'm imagining. Yeah, it's how they interplay, like building and tearing each other down, like a sense of having a purpose with many others, and yeah, also and sort of idolization or idealization of certain others, and then a bit of a letdown when that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
play out.
Yeah, I hear that. That's interesting. That's another dimension of it that I hadn't thought about. because yeah, quite often we're looking for people to fulfill the role of the ideal that we hold within ourselves, and of course that's always a dicey thing, because ideals don't have the dimensionality of all of this karma. You know, ideals, they dispense with all of the downsides.
but almost like without realizing, because we still strive for ideas and hold them in high regard.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we should, because it would be dismal if we gave up on those ideals.
Hmm.
You know, what else is it that improves us but the sense that something better is possible? And you know, we may as well have the best idea in mind even if it can't be realized. So it's a strange, you know, in a sense you could say that is a kind of cognitive embodiment of Gemini. Yeah, we have to hold that idealized vision, you know, the platonic forms, if you like, towards which we ever strive, but with the knowledge that we're living in reality, and that we really have to work with what does exist, and not not demean it for not living up to our ideals. So it seems like that's really a very elemental relationship, and something that is just probably one of the most important insights into the struggle that we're all presented with here.
Definitely.
So if we continue to kind of explore, there's this other five element relationship between Lilith and Jupiter. And so that shadow element comes into play in relation to experience in the same way. So it has that kind of
Mm.
transforming process. There's a sense of progression because the material of existence is ever being transformed. We're always sort of reinterpreting all the things that have happened to us. And sometimes it appears as if it's freaking awesome, and sometimes it appears as if it's a complete disaster.
Yep.
And so yeah, there's that the shadows interplay with that would be, you know, the darkness that in kind of descends from time to time on the sense of experience, and sometimes that darkness may actually be something where you're aware of how it strengthens you, and how it's a valuable thing to have folded into your experience, although at times it can be really terrifying and profoundly difficult.
Mm. So to me, these sort of like uh, what did you call them? Uh, the pentagram relationships. What are they
Yeah, they're
called?
called
Or
quintile. Yeah.
quintile? Yeah, they like a lot of like stages, or like I guess not a lot of stages, but like stages is what I imagine. And like the transformation, but like how transformation requires like energy, and it's not necessarily like a pretty process, but it's like a result.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think in particular, these are transformations that are happening with respect to the material world. You know, experience is something that happens through the senses, and so it's fundamentally experience of what happens. You know, we have feelings and thoughts that are, in some sense, a separate domain from what's happening in the material world, but it's all informed by the experience we're having. And so that kind of ugly process of transformation, I think, is one of the things that fundamentally characterizes the material world. And so, yeah, I think of the five elements as being a description of the transition of the material world from one state into another, and it
Mhm.
is a uncomfortable and at times hellish process. but not without its beauty. So that's the, another kind of Gemini reality underlying the whole situation, that, yeah, there are some ugly things happening as the material world transforms itself from one condition into another, and as energy is converted from a so-called usable state to a less usable state, which I think is really just a matter of perspective. And then, and at the same time, there's something kind of outrageously beautiful about it all too, which, you could say that whole thing is folded into Aquarius, that sensibility of, yeah, it's all one gigantic, unbelievable, incredible dance happening.
Mhm.
So we have covered most of, I guess we have this quincunx, which is not entirely different from the septile that we noted earlier between Pluto and Venus. So Venus and Neptune have a quincunx relationship, which is sort of like they just don't really operate together. So it's the same basic message, that the message that Jesus says of, you're either going to walk with me or you're going to stay home with mommy and daddy. It's like it's like it's like the bonding and the importance of the relationship. That's one thing, and then it's a whole other thing, this spiritual domain. And then the question of whether or not the two are mutually exclusive. You could say, well, yes, they are mutually exclusive to the extent that you're spending time in one or the other. But that doesn't mean that you have to spend time only in one or the other. And you have to wonder the extent to which the idea within these spiritual traditions, like, you really have to leave that family shit behind. It's like, okay, well, I mean, maybe that is the bottom line truth, but I don't know. I don't think it's a necessary choice that it has to be one way or the other, but they are going to be almost impossible to integrate.
And
That's for sure.
that's interesting because like my Venus is in Cancer, and to me, I imagine Cancer a lot with like family, and that's those sort of like feelings between people. So like I could see how those could like operate in separate directions.
Well, it's interesting that you have a fair amount of Gemini influencing Venus here, because you're just at 1 degree in Cancer. So it's really pretty close to the cusp there. So there is that kind of oppositional tension that's inherent within your Venus. But at the same time, there's so many different types of nurturing relationships. I mean, you can have the kind of inner planet pragmatic, like, I scratch your back, you scratch mine, like, I give you a meal, we share, like, all those kinds of basic connected to the material world type of things. But then there's also intellectual give and take, spiritual, perhaps emotional is a little bit separate from some of that inner planet stuff, where it's more like, community and just but all those things are kind of wrapped up, and sometimes you'll get some of it from some people and not, and then some of it from other people and not some parts of it. So it's relationships have a lot of variety to them. But for you, that give and take is extremely important, irrespective of whether it's, you may not be able to get everything from your family, but certainly there'll be things that you can get from them that you can't get from others.
Mhm.
So if we open it up to, I think I pretty much covered all that. And if we open it up another degree, then we start to get a whole other set of things we can look at.
Mm.
Northern node, novile with Uranus. So that being drawn towards um, getting things set up the way you want them to be. And that gift that you have with respect to being able to see things within the context of a universalist kind of Aquarian, everything dancing together. They are able to provide each other with a new, refreshing kind of thing. So what does that really mean? What does it look like? It's like getting your shit set up the way you want it to be set up is in some respects, like improving your ability to operate in that
Mm,
grander scheme in the which is a little bit opposite to what was happening before with the northern node and Jupiter. But Jupiter's more like your experience, right? Am I correct about that? Am I remembering that correctly? Northern node and Jupiter, yeah,
yeah.
have that septile. So experience is a little bit more you're it's like retroactive. You're looking at what happened before, right? But this is more about like what you have to offer. So there's a way in which getting shit set up the way you want it to is giving you new abilities and being able to offer things to the world, you might say.
Mm, yeah, I definitely feel that. It's interesting to me because it sounds like different relationships sort of exist like almost like repeatedly or like in different ways between like different aspects, because that makes me think of like earlier, I believe, when we were talking about yeah, like Virgo and Leo and Taurus as well, and like how um what's the one over there by like uh between Aries and Taurus? That's Saturn, right?
There, oh yeah, this here.
Yeah, that reminded me of when we were talking about Saturn earlier.
Huh. So tell me why, because I'm not quite making the connection yet.
In the sense that like um feeling like I'm more set up like in sort of a home makes
Mhm.
me uh more willing and want to like sort of like go in different directions actually. And like
Mm-hmm.
without that solid stable sense, I don't want to like start anything new.
Huh. Interesting. Well, this is saying, as I understand it, that getting that solid, stable sense, at the very least, is giving you a new sense of being, which suggests that you've always felt that this is lacking in some way, and yet at the same time, it's such an elemental part of your being. So,
Hmm.
and I guess in some ways you've expressed that a little bit, but yeah, I think you're right that the chart does have an interesting way, and it's not true with all charts, but it's true with more charts than you would think. That there's kind of a theme that's expressed in a bunch of different ways, where the same thing is being said through different aspect relations, and it always kind of blows my mind that that's the case, but it does seem to be. I'm sure that some sort of statistical analysis could calculate the probability of that happening on a random basis. But of course, this is not random. These are all cyclical patterns. So it's really not
Yeah,
random.
not
Um,
surprising.
right? And the other thing that's kind of interesting to note is that, as you work your way out in the solar system, your the amount of time that it takes for a planet to move from sign to sign is much longer. Jupiter takes a whole year in each sign, and then I think by the time you get to Pluto, it's something like 20 some odd years in each sign. So you start to really talk about generational characteristics the further you go out. So that's kind of interesting to
Mhm.
consider that on some level, there's a spiritual dimension that everyone from a certain generation is basically sharing. And that also there's a kind of
Mhm.
cosmic gift, right? That everyone of a certain generation is basically sharing. Now, it's going to operate a little differently within everyone because the aspect relationships change. But nevertheless, the basic character and the placement on the stage in the drama is basically the same. So that's also, I think, a neat way of gaining some perspective on what it is that we're living in. I mean, the thing that occurred to me a little while ago that I really like is that if it's the case that this so accurately describes the personality that we're experiencing in our life, then why can't we just say that the solar system has a personality?
Mm,
You
it's
know,
just reflected in us.
exactly. And so,
Right.
the concept as above, so below is an ancient one. I think it was mainly associated with Hermes Trismegistus, if I remember correctly, but it doesn't matter. It's a beautiful idea, and it makes perfect sense, like what we were talking about before, where systems theory, like if you have a system that's defining the basic state, then subsystems within it are going to be subject to that meta system, right? And from my point of view, personality is a artifact of consciousness, and consciousness is the thing that organizes substance. So, the sun organizes the the local region, our solar system. And so
Mm-hmm.
it is my, I would say, tendency to believe that the sun is a form of consciousness, and that the personality of the solar system is reflected. We see it within ourselves, and it tells
Mm-hmm.
us that the thing which is organizing this, it has its own kind of personality, and that it's our kind of local conscious node in what I believe is probably a universal network of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
And
That's how I imagine it. Like just one system. This is just the one that we experience, like so happen to at this
absolutely,
current moment in time.
absolutely, and in some ways, it feels like what a beautiful way to give us a message. you know, like I often think about how difficult would it be for the cells in the body to realize that they're living in this thing called me and what I am, right? And so, like,
Oof. Yeah.
human beings have sort of gotten to the point now where we're like pretty aware that there's something bigger going on here, and we've been trying to sort out what it is for a very long time. And so we've had like various ideas about how this whole thing is organized, but I mean, it seems pretty obvious just on the basis of the fact that we notice that when there is something that appears to be an organization going on here on planet Earth, it's due to the fact that there's a consciousness doing it, right? And different forms of consciousness organize things in different ways. But the fact that this has such an incredible correlation suggests how could it possibly be any other way, that there isn't a conscious organization happening out there that we are a reflection of, and that fundamentally the entire universe is a hierarchy of conscious nodes. you know
I
I
mean, I think it's just alive, like, because I mean, at the end of the day, we're just atoms and cells that can somehow relate to actually what's going on in some sort of way that, we call consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing to contemplate whether or not an atom has its own kind of form of consciousness, because fundamentally we know that atoms sense and respond in the same way that cells sense and respond, the same way that individuals sense and respond. Now, maybe they have a far more circumscribed capacity to sense and respond, but nevertheless, it's sensing and responding. And why should we presume that the agent of sense and response within it is something mechanical, instead of the thing that we know is the agent of sense and response, which is in ourselves and in other living beings? And I would say that it's pretty obvious that when it comes to the cells in our body, it's not just a mechanical thing, it's a living freaking organism, all the cells. And so it has some kind of experience of being, just like all creatures do. And there's a lot of very interesting implications to this way of looking at things. And I know that it really upsets the apple cart for a lot of people if you're married to various ideas about what's going on here. But I also think that when it comes to an Aquarian sensibility of what's going on, if we're going to have more respect for the planet that we're living on, for each other, for all the various organisms that are part of this biosphere that are really all very necessary for the functioning of the biosphere, whether we like them or not, and if we're going to have respect for the universe that we're living in, then understanding that everything is built on consciousness, I think would be helpful. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it does seem to me that once you're aware that everything is conscious, you might be less likely to treat it as if it were just something you could do whatever the hell you wanted to.
Exactly. Like I think of it from the perspective of like I try to consider like that, like um I mean, if God is what you want to call it, you know what I'm saying, spirit, the universe, whatever. Like we are it, like all of it, like you, me, even this laptop, like because we're here now, we're doing it. Like it's
Yeah.
live, baby. Like
I mean, in computer terms, I would say like, you have this incredible directory structure of conscious nodes, and the root directory is God, and
hmm
and we don't know how many layers there are. Like we're just not in a position to even theorize about it. I mean, well, we're in a position to theorize about it, but we're not in a position to make any definite declarations about it. But we can certainly say that there's plenty of reason to think that there's a good chance that there's a single node because at the top, because we see that the universe has a kind of order to it. Like every galaxy is structured in a way where you see that, yeah, there's an arrangement here. It's not just a random, you know, collection of stars kind of bounce. They maintains a certain type of form over some period of time, which is basically what organization is. So you could say that God has a Virgo attribute that puts things into some kind of order and may not necessarily be a so-called perfect order. In other words, all the ducks may not be lined up in exactly the same kind of row, like is the industrial model of what organization is, but a more natural sense of order, which is the way that makes sense to the particular being from whatever perspective that is. And God knows what perspective God has. So
exactly. That's why they say it's not for us to know. It's for us to experience and learn
absolutely,
about
and
it.
so we're each like a tiny little node of that conscious being, subset. So who knows how many layers down? So we're occupying an
hmm
incredibly humble position within the absolutely most incredibly divine spark, you could say. And that's why this whole thing is such a miracle. It's just incredible and mind-blowing. And fantastic, no matter what the horror is that comes along with it. But yeah, that's getting to a pretty elemental level, I'd say here. But it's also getting to a very cosmic level. So I'm wondering if there's anything in particular that you want to take a look at while we still have a little bit of time. Like, is there something that you would be wanting to explore more?
like certain aspects and things,
Yeah.
or
I mean, most
hmm,
people are typically interested in relationships or fortune, but that's not in any way necessarily where one would go. Just whatever it is that kind of comes up as a question. Like, is there any kind of general question that you feel about, hey, this whole life, like what it's doing, like if I could just know this about it, like what would that be?
um, I guess uh, having a better relationship with myself is like the first thing that comes to mind
Huh. Okay.
because I do struggle with that. Is to say like,
That's interesting. Yeah. So let's take a look at Mercury for a moment because that's the thing which is most in Leo. You got some other things that are influenced by Leo, but that's kind of where Leo is most fully represented. And I see there's a quincunx between. I'm sorry, not a quincunx. It's a semi-square between Mercury and Mars. So that's kind of interesting. Let me not say
hmm,
anything about that until I open it up. I'm going to open it up all the way and look at what else is going on here with Mercury. We got a septile with Venus. We got septile with Pluto, square with Ceres, square with Eros. Okay. and quintile with Lilith, and novile with Chiron. So this suggests that quite often when you take an action, you may, because it's on the basis of wanting to fulfill this Cancerian symbiosis, to get into a give and take relationship, your mind may feel as if it's taking away from your sense of self. Is that
Mm.
correct?
Yeah, yeah, like I feel like that's yeah, I mean it's a sort of, to me it's always a sort of like, I mean I guess for everyone it's like a do or don't, should I, shan't I? But for me, I guess the context of it is more so like definitely like being selfish versus like being selfless, but also like not being selfless in a degree to where, I mean it hurts me or people around me, in the same with being selfish.
Right. So it's a very delicate balance. It's really difficult to find the line where you're both able to take care of yourself and at the same time take care of others without feeling like one world or the other is getting diminished. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely.
And would you say that a lot of that has to do with the way that you think about it or the way that you feel about it? Like, is it mostly things that bother you in your mind about it, or do you feel emotionally more like kind of triggered by it?
Hmm. I'd say it's more so emotionally, because like my mind, I feel like is often more or less like made up in a sense, where like although I might have conflicting feelings, that will influence like my action. But like in my mind, like I'll know, like, oh, that's not really what I wanted to do, but I did it because like I felt this way. But I'm also working more on like feeling my feelings more, because like I felt like at times I wasn't very like, I guess the word, or possibly cognizant of yeah, my own emotions and taking the time to work through them and things like that.
Right. So, when it comes to the potential for new things happening within the emotional realm, you have two interesting relationships here, the tridecile and a novile. Tridecile with the southern node,
Mm,
novile with the vertex. So let's take a look at those two first because they suggest ways of bringing something new to the emotional experience, because we don't need to focus on necessarily the problems. It's more like, well, where are the opportunities? So let's say
mm,
moon and southern node first. So here we have southern node on the cusp in Pisces, close to Aquarius. And that's the tridecile, which means that there's a certain amount of harmony built into this relationship, which is like you have that ability to bridge emotionally opposite senses of what's going on and kind of be on both
mm.
sides of the fence, you could say. Uh,
Yeah.
and and everything kind of from your past and that thing that you're sort of wanting to get away from, but you know intimately is harmonious with that. It's like, yeah, you're good with that, but it's also like in the right amount, revisiting this history, you could say. The history that I think we characterized before as being related to a kind of sense of community, that's influencing this spiritual center, a kind of self-sacrificing spiritual being. So I think we kind of started talking about like religious community and family and that
Mm.
kind of thing, having that uh, that quality that you might have felt, yeah, this is good, but I kind of want to move away from. A revisiting of that in the right amount, not too much, can bring a new sense of feeling to things. Because
Mm.
One of the things that's difficult when you're following your own path is that you feel like you're disappointing people in community, that they
Mhm.
want you to fulfill a certain function, but you're heading in the direction that you want to go, and you, for your own purposes, have to explore what that's all about. So as you're heading in this direction, it's impossible not to sort of be less present within the realm of, let's say, that family domain that's hoping that you would be more involved in the community and willing to sacrifice your own interests in order to be part of it. Is all that ringing true?
It's like a struggle, and like like I get the feeling that um like I want to do things that people have never seen done, and that like I I feel like I know that it can be done and brought into fruition, but like at the same time I don't want to feel apart, or like like separating myself from like uh the community, or like my more so I guess like my family, and not necessarily like I guess like a bit of like their expectations and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So you said something about fulfilling this new thing that you're going after. I can't remember the way you characterized it, or I wasn't able to hear it.
Oh, just like I mean, because like um like I'm a programmer, like I'm very much so into technology, and I have like ideas and things that I work on, um and like I feel like um I see, I mean, I feel like I see it like a thing that doesn't exist, right? And like I'm heading towards that, and like the path that I make towards that to other people looks like really weird,
Huh.
or like I guess in my mind I imagine that it looks weird to them, or maybe I'm self-conscious about that or something, now that I'm thinking more about it.
Interesting.
um
Can you tell me something about what that is? The thing that you see that doesn't exist.
okay, so like say for instance, um thing that doesn't exist. I mean, like, for me, it's like ways of using technology and like programs and applications, and like um, even like different sort of studies, even related to sort of like technology and like the human experience, and how um, it's integrated into our lives and will continue to be forward and has been in the past, and all sorts of things.
Is this related to artificial intelligence?
Yeah, actually, yeah.
And so, would it be fair to say that that you conceive of artificial intelligence as being an other here?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, like an other, even in the sense that like I don't know what it'll look like or what it'll do
Right.
in like well,
Okay. I'm going to tell you what I see here, and if you don't want me to include this as part of what's posted online, you can let me know. Right. So here we have eros, which is, let's say, that image, that cherished image of another, right? That's where it is, and for you, it has new properties, right? And you could say that there's a strength that you've developed over the course of your experience with others, and that while you've had mixed experiences with others, you have a skill in reimagining others. Now,
mm,
what happens here? So first we have quincunx with moon, right? So this cherished image, it operates in a completely different realm from your emotional center, I guess you could say.
Mm.
It's a mild square to Mercury, so there's a way in which the mind can kind of get stuck a little bit on this image, and
Mm.
and it also it can make the power of this image can pull you away from relationships.
Mm.
This is like a selfish withdrawing. It's called Susca Square.
Yeah.
There's a quintile, that kind of 5 element thermodynamic material transformation type of thing with Neptune. So that is like there's a sense of being on a spiritual path with respect to this image. But it
Mm.
goes through its ups and downs. It goes through its transformations, and sometimes it seems clear, and sometimes it seems like mud, and sometimes it seems promising, and sometimes it seems demonic.
Mm-hmm.
You got your southern node here, septile. So, that image kind of cuts you off from that family thing, you could say, the thing that you know well, that's in that Pisces spiritual kind of let's say, how do we summarize this? Like the religious zone of community, you could say, that
Mm-hmm.
you're being asked to play a role in, but you're more likely to want to get away from. And yeah, so
Yeah.
it cuts you off from that, and then we have perhaps in some ways most relevant to the situation. We have a, a quintile relationship with Fortuna, which suggests that you have that same kind of
Mm.
thermodynamic, like sometimes it looks great, sometimes it looks terrible. Obviously within the context of a computer scientist, this is the hot project that everyone is working on in some way or another, right? So there's a lot of promise in it, but there's some downsides as well. It's not just a clear positive. There could be some real negatives involved as well.
Yeah.
So that's what I see happening
Mm.
with respect to this cherished image. And again, like I guess it might be interesting to explore the extent to which artificial intelligence can be reasonably thought of as being an other. It's, I guess, in some respects, the big question whether or not consciousness would be actually a byproduct of the effort to create artificial intelligence. And this actually does fit in with some of the things that we've already discussed, and it's kind of a long thing to
Wow.
get into, but if you want, I can try to describe some of the things that I think are relevant here.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So let's just kind of take a little tour into evolutionary history and kind of think about what it meant to be collectives of cells. Like if Lynn Margulis is correct in that the oldest period of time on planet Earth was basically characterized by bacteria. We had a planet that was covered in what was originally anaerobic bacteria, and they're the ones who produce the
Mm-hmm.
oxygen that we're now breathing. And of course, oxygen was a
Yep.
byproduct of their life cycle, and it was toxic to them. And so they basically came into contact with their own effluents, and they started to need to innovate. And so, in essence, they burrowed into each other. And one of them became the cell membrane, and the other one became the mitochondria. And you had the development of the eukaryotic cell. And then the eukaryotic cell was able to use oxygen as a source. So it basically took the garbage of the previous generation, the byproduct, the effluents, and turned it into the source. So that's why I say, like, turning something from a usable to a less
Mm.
usable state is a matter of perspective. So thermodynamics, it's like, yeah, from the point of view of the original organism, oxygen was an unusable state. But then evolution occurred, and there was innovation that was on, as far as I'm concerned, the basis of consciousness. and it may have been a very rudimentary consciousness, but a consciousness nonetheless, that decided, hey, I'm going to burrow into my neighbor and see if I can figure out some way to get away from this oxygen. Then the next thing you know, they're able to establish a relationship where oxygen becomes the source. So then you have a eukaryotic cell that can operate on the basis of oxygen, and they start to form into collectives, because that's basically what they would do in order to kind of improve their chances for survival. So cell collectives
Mm-hmm.
were kind of the most primitive organisms. And you could say that collectives, you can imagine that initially it was a kind of voluntary relationship that would form a cell collective. It's like, yeah, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And then over the course of time, as competition got more and more severe, the degree to which it was voluntary became less and less. And so the cells were more and more locked into specialized functions. So you can imagine that you might have cells locked into specialized function within collectives, and then collectives starting to interact with each other, and then you'd basically have various types of organisms where you'd have different organs that are interacting with each other. And so, what is it that actually creates the consciousness that organizes these organisms? And, when you have a cell collective, how do you maintain the relationships happening between all the various cells? Once you get a few thousand cells together, you need to have some kind of a nervous system. You have to have a way of communicating them all. So basically a network is formed that ties together all the different parts, and then it becomes the seat of the consciousness of that organism, and the consciousness of the individual parts is in some way or another diminished. And similarly, when you have organs that are tied together into organisms, you'd have a similar type of thing. The heart wants to do a certain thing, the lungs and the liver and all that, but when it really comes down to it, it's all the nervous system that's coordinating their behaviors, right? So
Mm-hmm.
now we're a social species, and we've got the organization of the internet, various networks that are tying everything together and kind of creating so it suggests the possibility that in the, resident in that network would be the possibility for a conscious being. But what does that do? What are the consequences for the individuals that are a part of that system? Right?
They become smaller, don't they?
Quite likely, yeah.
Hmm. Interesting. That's an interesting thought, because that's very close to, like, I feel like how I think about it. Like, at this point, I view, like, the internet. I mean, like, as you said, it's literally a network. Like, at its most basic level, um, I mean, it's the transfer of information between human beings at this point. So, like, if us as the um, organs, you know what I'm saying, and then now we come together to form this, like, thought collective, the internet,
Yeah.
and it's already, like, very much so influenced by what you would call, like, artificial intelligence, like all of these algorithms and things that are, like, are just so good at finding, like, what you like and what you'll be interested in, like.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard someone say recently that the power of the artificial intelligence in the average social media feed is, orders of magnitude greater than Deep Blue that beat Gary Kasparov at chess. So,
Oh yeah.
right? And so in essence, like, we are each playing a game as an individual with something that is already way more powerful than we could ever hope to manage,
Exactly.
and we're
So, like,
all,
I'm in thinking now that I mean, we're already affected by it. And, like, like I feel like you can look at just how quickly it was, like, adopted to
yeah,
where it's like, how is this not, you know what I'm saying, like, what you would call a quote unquote natural evolution, you know what I'm saying, of where we go with ourselves, like,
I agree.
you know.
I think that, in a certain sense, this is like the inexorable movement of history, and certain things you can't really choose, So here's a great example of we're pulled in a certain direction. We want things to be set up a certain way, but the negotiation with reality means that destiny has a lot to do with circumstances that we're born into. So, here we are. We're a global civilization that hasn't quite tied itself together yet. We're having an awful lot of problems, and we do have this incredibly powerful technology that might allow us to control a situation that might otherwise turn into hell. So, on
Mhm.
some level, I have a great deal of sympathy with that project that you're speaking about and that you're involved in. But of course, there are consequences, and then it's not just consequences for, the species in general, but it's also personal. So the question is, to what extent does that image play a good role for you in your life? And it's like, I'm looking at all the relationships. I opened it up here. The most powerful relationships that we have here with Eros is, a septile, you have a quintile. Did we talk about this one? We didn't, did we? So it's a taijutsu between Saturn and which is another kind of transformation. I would say it's related to quintile, but it's more direct. It's more of a uh, like I have a real feeling for what it feels like, but it's kind of hard to describe because the way yin and yang transform into each other, it's like you think that it's going to be the fullness of one, and then all of a sudden the other one appears, you know, and then it starts to take over, and it's the other one. So so that's within the context of Saturn. So like new things opening up. It's like I guess I would have to say, based on the conversation we just had, that this image of let's say that AI other at times has this incredibly beautiful appearance and opening up your experience, like the sense of like, wow, a whole other thing possible. And then it opens up your experience in the opposite direction where it's like, wow, that could be horrifying. And I think, of course, all of us who contemplate the the potential nature of AI and the role that it's going to play for us in the future have a similar type of experience, but here it is in your chart, front and center, in a very powerful relationship indeed, right? So what I don't see here is anything that's obviously like a novile or a decile that says, yeah, like this is a really progressive thing. And so I would have to say, like,
Mm.
there's some way or another in which this image plays the role that it plays in most of our lives, which is, one of a degree of frustration. Quite often this is associated with a romantic image that's like the ideal person,
Mm.
which you can never quite ever have a relationship with because it's an ideal, right? And so it has a tendency to often get in the way of real relationships, right? Now, this may have a
Mm.
number of different meanings for you, but we've identified one of them. And what's suggested here is that while there may be some interesting things happening, so quintile, it's not all bad news. There's a developmental process, but it's one that's kind of inexorable, and that has the downsides of that kind of material transformation world. But then you also have things that are more overtly problematic in terms of like the effect that it has on your relationships and the effect that it has on your emotional sense of being. So getting back to the thing we were talking about before, like, I wonder to what extent that the pursuit of this will create a greater sense of separation from the self, because
Mm.
we have Gemini, and a lot of what's going on with you has to do with that divide between taking care of your own needs here and being a Cancerian in relationship to others. So the fact that like this is really operating on a completely different path, because that's what Quinsunks is saying. It's like they just cannot really meet. So this image that you're attached to is basically incompatible with your emotional life, right? So it
Well,
presents.
it's funny. I get that feeling so much.
Is that's resonating? I couldn't quite hear what you said, but it sounded like you're saying, yeah, that's kind of resonating.
Yeah, I feel that a lot. Yeah, because I don't want to be like Bill Gates. Like
Right.
even I want to pursue technology. I don't want to be like one of these guys. Like I have no desire for that.
Well,
But like,
I'd say it's pretty clear. It's saying you got to let go of that image and not let it rule you. You know,
yeah,
I hate to say anything that definitive, but it's kind of saying that. And you know, it doesn't mean that what you're doing doesn't have all kinds of interesting developmental potential, right? And it would be really interesting
yeah,
to discuss what other possibilities are there. You know, like there's something about machine learning that is fascinating, and it's not necessarily the same as artificial intelligence, right? Because
hmm
you know, there's an awful lot of fine lines here, and unfortunately, a lot of those lines get blurred just because the marketplace does what it does. You know, but that doesn't mean that we can't create lines for ourselves and whatever it is that we're going to end up doing. You know, and I don't know how much you've looked into like the history of technology and stuff like that, but a lot of the people who end up being at the forefront of various kinds of technological developments, they really suffer some horrible fucking shit. It just seems like there's some karma that comes along with that kind of thing. That you know, it's one thing to operate behind the point of the spear, you know, but it's the point of the spear that takes the biggest brunt of whatever it is that ends up happening, both in terms of like, you know, impact in the material world and the karma in the spiritual world. There's a great
yeah.
Taoist saying that basically says, those who go first are the targets of the arrows of those who come after them. You know,
Very true.
and of course it's like I think that every how shall I say this? Every person with a degree of aspiration wants to be a groundbreaker and wants to kind of like make their mark in the world and you know see their names in lights in one way or another. But I do think of that as being a kind of a temptation that those of us who become more mature start to reflect on and realize that uh, the dangers in all of that, both in terms of what happens to you in relation to the society you're living in, and also what happens to you in your own soul, are really, really severe.
Mm,
And that you know, keeping that sense of the humility of the position that we're actually in, that we're you know somewhere in
mm,
this hierarchy of consciousness, we're kind of relatively low level on a little planet, and then it's just at the edge of this galaxy, and that God knows what's really going on out there. And you know that is, I think, a great place to find home because there's stability in that understanding of our position, of the reality of our position, and and we live in a culture that has really exalted the self in a way, and they used to call that hubris, and hubris was always punished by the gods. That was the characteristic of hubris would be that the arrogance of mankind would be such that it would offend the gods and that it would cause mankind to fall, you know, and it does
yeah.
seem like
I think uh, who is it? Icarus flying too close to the sun. Like,
absolutely, absolutely, yeah, that's a great illustration of the concept, and it's interesting because of course it was his father's idea. Right. uh,
mm,
so it's like the son didn't quite realize the seriousness of what it meant to strap those wings on,
mm,
and the father didn't quite realize the seriousness of what it meant to invent them.
mm.
So yeah, some pretty heavy elemental stuff to consider here.
To me, it sounds like, and I mean, which is like feelings and thoughts that I have of like, I guess like repurposing, like I feel like sort of my skill and talent in a way, like, um, because like aside from like technology. I've sort of, I guess, like I'd say, like sort of dabbled in a bit like education. I would say, um,
Hmm.
I've sort of always also existed in a space of um, sharing, I guess, yeah, like sharing knowledge with others. Um, like I've been a tutor, I've been a mentor at like a robotics camp. I used to work at space camp.
Hmm.
Um,
Cool.
so like being in those sort of spaces.
Right.
But like when I feel like when I want to serve myself more individualistically though, I definitely like go like away from that. But
Interesting.
might not necessarily find fulfillment in it like now. Like I don't work at space camp anymore. I can tell you that when I worked there I made a lot less money than I do now. Um
Right. Right.
do I like the job more? Not, you know, it depends on the day.
Right. Yeah. So space camp is down here, you could say. It's that it's not only like the deepening of knowledge, but it's the sharing of knowledge, right? And it's in a sense, it's like serving a kind of more fulfilling spiritual purpose. You could say that it has that potential to relinquish some of the drama that you feel. That's more like self motivated here
Mm.
in in Leo, and also where you're making the money, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Yeah, it's all laid out pretty clearly here. It's a really interesting set of dynamics to work with, and it seems like there's plenty to ponder, and it might be a good time to think about drawing this session to a close.
Sounds good. Yeah, this has been, yeah, very insightful. I greatly appreciate you for yeah, doing this and offering this. Yeah.